Before we begin this thrilling and engaging radio broadcast, we have a small request. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the Voicecast for more captivating broadcasts like this one. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, what are you doing right now? Where are you from? And what time are you watching this? We'd love to hear from you. Now get comfortable, relax, and prepare yourself as we dive into tonight's chilling journey. Let's begin. Good morning, listeners. This is your emergency broadcast cutting into your daily routine with urgent news. Please, if you are near a radio, stay tuned. It was supposed to be just another peaceful morning. Calm skies, a slight breeze, nothing out of the ordinary. The world, it seemed, was as normal as it could be, but that peace shattered in an instant. A warning crackles through the air, interrupting the silence. Attention, citizens, this is a national emergency. We have received reports of a deadly outbreak spreading rapidly. What appears to be a virus, turning its victims into uncontrollable violent beings, has reached our cities. The sound of the broadcast trembles in the air, cutting through the morning chatter, and in that moment, a heavy realization settles in. This is not just another warning. This is the beginning of something far worse, and the world as we know it may never be the same again. The panic was quick to follow. Within hours, the reports flooded in, detailing the horrors unfolding in the nation's most unexpected places. Luxury hotels, once havens of comfort, a world away from the chaos of the streets, had become battlegrounds. At one such establishment, a towering symbol of wealth and sophistication, it started innocently enough. Guests lounging in the lobby, sipping coffee, chatting in hushed tones about the latest business deals. It was the calm before the storm. But then, an ear-piercing crash reverberated through the grand entrance. The sound of shattering glass. Screams erupted. The polished marble floors that once gleamed with elegance now seemed to groan under the weight of something much darker. A figure, no, a thing, appears. It stumbles into view, its movements jerky, disjointed, blood smeared across its face, its eyes vacant, devoid of life. The undead had arrived, the first of many. Before the guests could even react, others followed, like a tide crashing into the fragile walls of the hotel. Panicked shouts and running feet fill the air as the luxury hotel, with its high chandeliers and pristine carpets, fades into a nightmare. The guests, once seeking comfort, now find themselves fighting for survival. It happens so fast, too fast. One moment, the hotel is a place of peace. The next, it is a prison. Screams echo down the corridors, bouncing off walls that once held laughter and luxury. The undead are everywhere now, pouring through the shattered entrance and creeping through hidden passageways, drawn to the scent of living flesh. What was once a safe haven has turned into a death trap. The hotel's staff, trained to cater to the whims of the wealthy, now find themselves leading terrified guests through hallways that have become unrecognizable. Trapped. The elevators, once symbols of convenience, are now useless, jammed with people screaming for an escape that may never come. The power flickers and dies. The silence of the hotel is replaced by the horrified, labored breathing of those who still cling to life. And outside? The world is already crumbling. The city's sirens scream in the distance, but for those inside the hotel, there's nowhere left to run. The battle for survival begins here, in a place that was never meant for chaos. The air inside the hotel is thick now, heavy, suffocating. Once, this place was a monument to wealth, its sleek marble floors and glittering chandeliers promising a reprieve from the chaos of the world outside. But now, that world outside has come crashing in. The hotel's once pristine lobby is eerily quiet, save for the faint, unsettling echoes of the undead that have begun to surround it. The first whispers of danger reach the staff earlier, but there's no more time for denial. Those who haven't yet been overwhelmed by fear are frantically trying to organize some sort of escape, but it's too late. The doors, those grand, imposing barriers meant to separate guests from the outside world, are useless now. The windows, already shattered. The security systems, once state of the art, are failing, hacked, or destroyed. No more safe zones. Outside, the city is a massive chaos, but inside this towering fortress of luxury, the danger is just beginning to seep in. The undead swarm in waves, relentless and unforgiving. Every attempt to flee is met with a wall of terror. No one can leave. The building is sealed, and the survivors inside must now face what was once unimaginable, the reality of their entrapment. The panic hits fast, crashing into the pristine calm of the hotel like a tidal wave. Screams, sharp, terrified, rip through the air as the first of the guests realize the true extent of the horror they're trapped in. The hotel, which had been a paradise of opulence, is now a scene of utter dread. The polished floors are streaked with panic, the air thick with the sound of frantic footsteps as the guests scramble for safety. There's no place left untouched by the chaos. The air, once filled with the soft hum of a luxury experience, is now filled with the harsh wail of a siren. Its piercing tone signaling that what's coming next is far worse than any of them could have ever imagined. The undead are closing in, and the survivors' hope for safety is slipping through their fingers like sand. From the rooftop to the underground levels, every corner of this once immaculate hotel is echoing with the sounds of desperation. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, just the blood-curdling realization that the luxury they once had is gone, lost to the dead who now haunt these walls. It started with a whisper, a story from a remote town far from the reach of any major news outlet. At first, it seemed nothing more than a strange viral infection, a virus that looked like rabies but acted far worse. The symptoms were swift and brutal. Fever, violent aggression, and within hours, total loss of control. But that was only the beginning. As the infection spread, something more terrifying became clear. These were not the ravings of a rabid animal. These were the actions of something worse. The infected were no longer human. They were predators, mindless, relentless, driven only by hunger. They sought nothing but to feed, and feed they did. At first, it was contained in small, rural communities. Health agencies were slow to react, too slow. They called it an isolated outbreak. They called it a mystery, but the virus did not wait for answers. It moved with an urgency that no one anticipated, and just as quickly as it spread, the infection began to evolve. The victims, once ordinary people, were now transformed into something darker, more deadly. They moved in packs, their skin decaying, their eyes empty, their only impulse the insatiable hunger for the living. It wasn't just a virus anymore. It was an apocalypse in the making. The virus didn't remain in small towns for long. No, it spread like wildfire, crossing state lines, national borders, and oceans with a speed that defied belief. The first signs of the outbreak were easy to dismiss until it wasn't. Hospitals, once prepared for the usual flu season, quickly became overwhelmed. Entire communities were brought to their knees. It didn't take long for cities to fall. Major urban centers, cities like New York, London, Tokyo, became epicenters of chaos. The authorities, still scrambling to understand what they were dealing with, declared martial law in some areas, while others simply locked down, hoping that the virus would somehow tire itself out. But it didn't. It was unstoppable. As the first days blurred into weeks, reports from around the world grew more desperate. Governments tried to contain the virus, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a paper towel. The streets ran with fear, then with blood. The buildings that once stood as symbols of civilization were overrun. People, innocent, everyday people, transformed into predators. And yet, the worst part was not the horror of the infection. It was the silence of the world watching it unfold. There were no clear answers, no clear direction, only chaos. Breaking news. The phrase had never carried so much weight. Government officials, once calm and composed, now appeared frantic. There was no plan left. The world's leaders were scrambling. Phone lines were jammed, systems overloaded. It wasn't just the virus they were losing control of. It was everything. The first emergency broadcast promised containment. They were wrong. The second promised hope. They were wrong again. And now all that remained were hushed whispers and the sound of collapsing order. Conflicting reports flooded the airwaves. Some said it was too late to contain. Others said they were still fighting it. But no one knew the truth. What was certain, however, was that the government's inability to manage the crisis had accelerated the downfall of civilization itself. Authorities couldn't enforce quarantines. Military units were overrun. Police forces disappeared, scattered to the wind, and even the most secure facilities, once thought to be impenetrable, fell to the infection. There were no safe zones. For the survivors, it was clear. The world was spiraling into a new, brutal reality, and anyone still clinging to hope would soon realize it was just another luxury they could no longer afford. The world was not coming back from this. It was breaking, and there was no way to stop it. It was supposed to be a refuge. Luxury hotels, high-rise buildings, and exclusive complexes that promised safety and isolation. These towering structures were once symbols of wealth and stability, designed to protect the rich and powerful from the dangers of the world below. But now they are prisons. As the infection spread, the very isolation that once offered comfort became the guests' worst nightmare. The moment the first wave of zombies hit the gates, there was no escape. The luxury that had been a buffer against the world outside now felt like a cage, its walls towering high, but closing in all the same. The elite believed they had outsmarted the chaos. They thought their private security teams, their high-tech surveillance, and their emergency protocols would be enough to keep them safe. But the virus, relentless and unforgiving, did not discriminate. The undead were just as capable of tearing through steel doors as they were wooden ones, and so the elite were trapped. What was once a sanctuary now echoed with the sounds of panic as the undead surged through lobbies and hallways, tearing down everything in their path. The security systems that had been their pride now failed them, and the guests, once pampered in their gilded rooms, were reduced to frantic survivors. Inside the walls of the luxurious haven, the first cracks in the facade were barely noticeable. At first, the wealthy residents felt insulated, protected by the height of their towers and the exclusivity of their neighborhoods. But as the infection spread faster than anyone anticipated, that illusion of security shattered. The first signs came in the form of a few whispers, reports from the outside world, telling of destruction just beyond the gates. But the elite dismissed it. It's contained, they said. It won't reach us. But they were wrong. Then the first screams echoed through the hallways. It didn't take long before the corridors that once buzzed with idle chatter and the clinking of expensive glasses were drowned out by the violent pounding of the undead. The security staff, trained to deal with lesser threats, were overwhelmed in seconds. Panic set in. Those who had once believed themselves untouchable, top-tier businessmen, politicians, celebrities, were now locked in their rooms, barricading doors with whatever they could find. The virus had ripped away their illusion of control, and now even the most opulent of surroundings were no refuge. It was every man, woman, and child for themselves. What had once been a sanctuary was now a death trap, and the elites were left grappling with the horrifying realization, no matter how much money or power they had, they were just as vulnerable as anyone else. Amid the chaos, we meet the survivors. The hotel manager, once the epitome of calm professionalism, is now a man pushed to his limits. His voice trembles as he speaks over the intercom, trying to keep order among his panicked guests. Please remain calm. We are working to secure the building. Stay in your rooms and help will come. But his words ring hollow. There is no help coming. He knows it. They all know it. Then there's the celebrity, once adored by millions, now reduced to a shell of their former self. They're holed up in a suite, surrounded by bodyguards. But the undead are relentless. The celebrity's agent keeps urging them to stay quiet, to keep a low profile, but the sounds of the oncoming horde draw closer. The walls that once separated them from the rest of the world have become invisible, and their carefully constructed world is crumbling. In a corner of the hotel, two newlyweds, young, hopeful, in love, find themselves trapped on the upper floor. What was meant to be the happiest day of their lives has turned into a nightmare. As they hold each other close, the terror of the outside world seeps into their honeymoon suite. There are no romantic getaways now, only survival instincts kicking in. They have each other, but for how long? And then there's the chef. The man who has spent years perfecting his craftsy in the hotel's kitchen is now using his skills for a much darker purpose. Survival. With a butcher's knife in hand, he has become an unlikely leader, rallying the frightened survivors, leading them through the kitchen's back passages, trying to find a way out. He's a man of action now, not words. Every knife cut, every pan flipped is a fight for survival. In this hotel, once a place of indulgence, lives are being shattered, hopes are being lost, and the undead are not the only thing that's consuming them. It was a moment that no one could have predicted, a crack in the surface that shattered the false security of the hotel's opulence. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and fresh linens, a world where nothing seemed out of place. But then, the first crash came. It wasn't the sound of a broken glass or a misplaced vase. It was something far worse. A sharp, sickening thud echoed through the lobby as the front entrance buckled under the force of the undead, a swarm pushing their way through the glass doors with terrifying ease. The pristine facade of the luxury hotel, its marble floors, golden chandeliers, and quiet elegance, was suddenly rendered irrelevant. The first scream rang out, followed by a second and then a third. Staff members, once so calm and composed, scrambled for cover, some rushing to lock the doors while others darted to the elevators, desperately trying to escape. Guests, oblivious just moments before to the horrors beyond the gates, now found themselves face to face with the very thing they feared: death. The undead flooded the lobby like a tidal wave, their ravenous eyes fixed on the living. Chaos erupted. The sound of running feet, the desperate cries for help, and the guttural growls of the zombies filled the air. The luxury hotel, once a haven for the wealthy and powerful, had now become a death trap, and there was no place to hide. For those unlucky enough to be near the entrance, there was no escape. A woman screamed, clutching her child to her chest, while a man shoved past them, knocking over a vase in his frantic attempt to get away. The receptionist, still trying to hold the front desk together, was dragged into the crowd, swallowed by the madness. The once serene, orderly world of the hotel was now a chaotic mess of bodies, blood, and terror. But even as the first breach turned the hotel into a nightmare, the staff and guests didn't know this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The beautiful hallways, adorned with plush carpets and towering paintings, once felt like a labyrinth of luxury. Now they were a maze of death. Guests who had just moments ago been enjoying their lavish surroundings were now sprinting, panicked, down the same corridors they once admired. Every turn brought them face to face with an uncertain fate, each hallway an avenue of escape or another trap. The power flickered, plunging the hotel into eerie half-light as the overhead chandeliers swayed ominously. The elevators, once symbols of convenience, now stood useless, their doors slammed shut, the button panel unresponsive. Those who attempted to flee through the stairwells were met with dark, narrow passages that seemed to close in around them, With every step, some turned back in fear, only to find themselves facing the nightmare they had hoped to outrun. The sound of pounding footsteps reverberated in the hallways, some from survivors, others from the undead that had infiltrated deeper into the building. As the guests scrambled to find safety, the truth became all too clear. There was nowhere to go. The windows, once offering breathtaking views of the city below, were now barriers to escape. The doors, locked and reinforced, only kept the terror at bay for so long. Among the panicked masses, a young couple found themselves cornered by the elevators, their breaths shallow and quick. The woman clutched her partner's arm, pulling him back as a grotesque figure, its flesh torn and rotting, shambled into view. The man pushed her behind him, his eyes wide with fear. But the truth settled in quickly. It was only a matter of time. They had no weapons, no way out, and the undead were closing in. Further down the hallway, the hotel manager, a man who had spent decades making sure everything ran smoothly, was now desperately trying to regain some semblance of control. His voice cracked over the intercom. "Please, everyone, head to the emergency exits. Remain calm. Help is on the way." But there was no calm, no help. The intercom crackled once more, then fell silent. In the grand ballroom, once the site of elegant soirees and celebrations, a group of guests had barricaded themselves in. But with every minute that passed, they realized the barricade wouldn't hold for long. The undead were relentless, their growls growing louder with each passing second. Desperation settled over the survivors like a heavy fog. The hotel that had once promised comfort now felt like a tomb, and those trapped inside were beginning to see just how fragile their world truly was. Their safety, their luxury, it had all been an illusion. And outside, the world was falling apart. But here, within these walls, there was only terror and the waiting. The sudden jarring screech of metal echoed through the hallway as the elevator doors slid open, but no one dared step inside. For the few remaining guests, the once trusted elevators had become a death trap. The lights flickered again, dimming, then flickering back on in a sickly yellow hue, casting long shadows across the marble floors. A low hum was the only sound in the hotel now, a constant reminder of the power flickering on and off, like a heartbeat slowly sputtering out. For a moment, everything was eerily still, almost as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. But then, the sound of shuffling feet grew louder, closer. The dead were near. As the elevator doors remained open, inviting only the darkness behind them, the guests and staff who had been clinging to hope began to realize what was becoming painfully clear. The elevators were no longer a means of escape. The panic-stricken cries of people trying to escape the hotel through the emergency stairwells grew more frantic, but the lights failed again, plunging them into darkness. That oppressive silence, broken only by distant growls, seemed to press down on everyone in the hotel. Some guests, desperate, pushed the elevator buttons again and again, but the system was beyond repair. The metal cables inside the shafts had snapped under the strain, and even if they hadn't, no one would risk riding to the safety of lower floors now. The power was out. The only thing moving now were the dead, dragging themselves through the hallways in search of fresh prey. In the dim light, the small group of survivors huddled near a staircase, too terrified to move. Every breath felt like it could be their last. The stairwell, once a quick path to safety, was now a trap. Every moment spent trying to escape the hotel felt like a mistake. The only thing left was the terrifying, inevitable truth. The elevators weren't coming. The building was as good as a tomb now. But even worse, no one knew how long they could stay in this silence before the undead reached them. Each minute of stillness only increased the pressure, the panic rising, like a tide, threatening to overwhelm them. The hotel manager, George, was a man used to smooth operations, the kind of person who ensured everything ran like clockwork. But now, amidst the chaos, his calm demeanor seemed almost laughable. He stood at the front desk, staring at the chaos unfolding in front of him. Guests were frantic. Some were screaming, others crying, and the rest were running in every direction, hoping to find an escape that didn't exist. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and fear as George spoke into the intercom. His voice, usually calm and composed, now cracked with desperation. "Please, everyone, stay in your rooms. The situation is under control." The lie left his lips easily, but the truth was harder to swallow. He didn't have control. Not anymore. Behind him, the sound of breaking glass signaled another breach. Undead were flooding into the lobby. His eyes darted to the few hotel staff still with him, but they too seemed paralyzed by fear. It was hard to blame them. In the face of an unstoppable horde, what could they do? George tightened his grip on the desk, swallowing the lump in his throat. He couldn't lose them. He couldn't lose the guests, the people he was responsible for. He barked orders, his voice rising above the panic. "Move! Block the doors! Get everyone into the staff rooms! We need to secure this building!" For a brief moment, it seemed as though the survivors might make it. The doors were barricaded, the staff rooms locked, but the moment didn't last. The undead grew bolder, pressing harder against the barricades, their moans growing louder, closer. George's mind raced. He needed a plan, an escape route. But every path led to the same inescapable conclusion. There was no easy way out. He could hear the pounding on the barricade and the groans of the zombies inching their way toward the survivors. "George," a voice called, breaking his focus. It was Lucy, the head of housekeeping. Her eyes were wide with terror. "We can't hold them off much longer." George knew she was right. Every second was precious, but it was slipping away too quickly. He turned toward the emergency exit, hoping, praying that it would still be clear. But as he made the move to head for the back door, a scream from the lobby froze him in place. It was too late. They were already inside. The penthouse was meant to be a sanctuary, a place for the rich and powerful to rest, away from the chaos of the world below. Now, it had become their last line of defense against the storm of death that raged beneath them. In the lavishly furnished suite, the survivors, now fewer in number, huddled together, trying to maintain some semblance of order. They were cornered in the highest point of the hotel, and while they might have thought they were safe, they were sorely mistaken. The group consisted of a mix of personalities. A recently married couple, huddled close together, their hands intertwined as though their connection could somehow shield them from the horrors outside. A chef, grizzled and covered in sweat, holding a butcher's knife with a grim expression, and a businessman who had lost everything, his once pristine suit now soaked in blood. "We need to keep quiet," the chef whispered, his voice tense but steady. "If they don't hear us, we have a chance." But the silence was deafening. The occasional thud against the door, the sound of the undead testing their barriers, was the only reminder that they weren't alone in the world anymore. The couple clung to each other, eyes wide in terror. The chef sharpened his knife in quiet desperation, while the businessman muttered to himself, pacing in small circles. The weight of their fear pressed down like a physical force, making each breath feel heavier than the last. Then came the unmistakable sound, the scraping of claws on wood. The undead were trying to break through. "We can't just wait here," the businessman growled. "We need a way out, now!" But the chef shook his head. "There is no way out. We stay here or we die." A cold silence fell over the group as they realized the truth. They were running out of time and out of options. The zombies were already at the door. Every minute they hesitated felt like an eternity, and soon they would be forced to make a decision. Fight or die. The door splintered, and the first of the undead clawed through. In the midst of this unimaginable horror, there's one thing the guests in the hotel didn't expect. celebrities hiding alongside them. Famous faces, the kind of people whose lives were once on display for millions to see, now reduced to just another terrified survivor in a locked room. One such figure was Adam Mitchell, an actor whose face was plastered on billboards and magazine covers. He had arrived at the hotel a day before the outbreak, his high-profile visit meant to announce a new film. But now, in the exclusive suite at the top of the hotel, Adam was just another man fighting to survive. His fame didn't matter. The red carpets, the flashing cameras, none of that meant a thing when the undead were pounding on the doors. Adam stood near the large windows, his eyes scanning the streets below. The once bustling city now felt empty, ghostly. The few remaining people could be seen in fleeting glimpses, running for their lives. He'd used his celebrity status to secure a suite with reinforced doors, but the undead weren't bothered by locks or luxury. They were relentless, driven by some primal hunger. "I'm not going out like this," he muttered to himself, pacing. His voice cracked, revealing the fear beneath the tough exterior. He'd never been in a situation like this, never faced real danger, let alone the certainty of death. He grabbed his phone, hoping for a signal, but all he saw was a warning, no network connection. He turned it off in frustration, clenching his fists. Behind him, his manager, a frantic woman named Clara, paced nervously. "We need to stay calm. Help's coming," she lied, though she could barely look Adam in the eye. The truth was, no help was coming. They were on their own now. The silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of scraping nails on wood. Adam froze, his heart racing. It was them, outside the door. The undead were closer. "Do you hear that?" Clara whispered, a tremor in her voice. Adam nodded, his face pale. "I hear it, and it's getting louder." He didn't know how long they could hide. Fame wasn't going to save them anymore. The only question now was how long they could survive before the undead found a way in. In the kitchen, the hotel chef, Leo Ramirez, was doing what he did best, preparing food. But this time the stakes were much higher. The gleaming knives and cutting boards, once tools of his trade, were now his only means of defense. Leo moved with surprising calmness as the world outside fell apart. The kitchen had become his refuge, his fortress. He hadn't signed up for this. He was supposed to be making five-star meals, not defending against the walking dead. Yet, the kitchen offered the only safety from the chaos that raged outside its walls. "Stay focused," he muttered under his breath, sharpening a large butcher's knife. He checked the locked doors once more. They were secure for now, but he knew the undead weren't easily deterred. A noise echoed from behind the door, a loud thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of clawing at wood. Leo's grip tightened on the handle of the knife. He had to make sure the other staff members stayed calm. If the undead broke in here, the last line of defense would fall. There was no way out of the kitchen once they breached the door. He looked around at the kitchen, then grabbed a fire extinguisher from the shelf. It wasn't ideal, but in a pinch it would do. Every kitchen tool, every heavy pan, every sharp object now had a purpose. Another thud against the door. Leo's heart raced. The undead weren't far behind. They were getting closer. The only question now was how much longer they could hold them off. The idea of escape had once seemed absurd, impossible even. But now it was their only option. The hotel's security system, once an impregnable fortress, had fallen apart like a house of cards. The alarms had gone off hours ago. But now, even the backup generators had failed. The elevators were useless, and the stairwells were already overrun with the undead. There was only one way left: up. The survivors who had gathered in the lobby were a ragtag group now. Those who had managed to evade the initial wave of zombies. There was George, the hotel manager, his face drawn and pale from exhaustion. Lucy, the head of housekeeping, who clutched a broom as if it could stop the horrors outside. And Adam, the actor, now desperate, and fearful. Together, they were all that remained. "Up to the roof," George said, his voice hoarse. "That's the only chance we have left." The others nodded, understanding that this was no longer about finding safety. It was about survival. They moved as quietly as they could, staying low to avoid drawing attention. But every step felt like a lifetime. The door to the stairwell groaned as George pushed it open. They all froze. It had been too quiet for too long. A soft shuffle, a low growl, then the unmistakable sound of undead feet dragging across the floor. The first zombie appeared in the hallway, its vacant eyes fixed on them. Without a word, George led the group up the stairs, the pressure mounting with each step. They could hear the zombies growing closer behind them, their moans louder now, more frantic. It was a race against time, and they weren't sure who was winning. By the time they reached the rooftop door, George's heart was pounding in his chest. The door was locked, and the key card was useless now. But there was no time to waste. He threw his shoulder into the door, and it gave way with a crack. For a moment, there was only silence. The roof loomed above them, bathed in an eerie twilight glow. The city lay sprawled out below, vast, desolate, and empty. But the moment didn't last long. Behind them, the moans grew louder, and the undead began to break through the door, one after another. They were almost out of time. With no other option, they rushed to the edge of the roof, desperate to find a way down or a way out. But as they looked around, their hope quickly dissolved. Below them, the city was crawling with the undead. There was no place to run. They were trapped, stuck between the horde and the edge of a building, facing a choice that could be their last. Would they fight, or would they take the final plunge into the unknown? For a moment, there was stillness, a fragile calm that tricked the survivors into believing they had a chance. The rooftop was quiet save for the faint hum of distant sirens and the crackling static from a dying radio. But that quiet only made the impending storm feel heavier. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next tragedy to unfold. Then, without warning, the silence was broken. A loud crash echoed from below, followed by the unmistakable sound of smashing glass. Panic erupted as the survivors on the rooftop whipped around, their hearts racing. The undead had breached the lower levels, and the floodgates had opened. In a matter of minutes, the hotel, once a fortress, was transformed into a death trap. The sound of shuffling feet and guttural moans grew louder, reverberating through the walls. The survivors' hopes of escape, built on the fragile hope of a rescue, began to shatter. "They're here," George, the hotel manager, muttered under his breath. His voice trembled, betraying the panic he had worked so hard to suppress. Lucy, the head of housekeeping, clutched a broom tightly, eyes wide with fear. "We can't hold them off much longer," she screamed. Adam, the actor who had been so confident just hours ago, now looked lost, his face pale and stricken. "What do we do?" His voice cracked, the question more a cry for help than a request for strategy. The elevator doors pinged open with a metallic screech. One by one, the survivors rushed to the staircase, but it was already too late. The undead were pouring in from the lobby, blocking their exit. "Up, now!" George barked, shoving Lucy and Adam toward the narrow stairwell. But as they sprinted, the world around them seemed to close in. The walls trembled as another wave of zombies arrived, pushing closer, faster. The hope that had lingered in their hearts was quickly overwhelmed by the terror that now filled the hotel. The night had turned darker, not only outside, but inside, as their chances of survival grew slimmer with each passing second. They thought it was their salvation, a shining beacon in a sea of hopelessness. From the rooftop, George and the others saw it, a helicopter slowly descending toward them. The sound of the rotors cut through the air like a symphony of hope, and for a fleeting moment, the survivors allowed themselves to believe they were about to escape. "Look, they're coming!" Lucy shouted, pointing at the aircraft. "We're saved!" Adam, his voice trembling with emotion, grabbed George's arm. "Is this real? Are we really going to make it out of here?" George could hardly believe it. But he didn't hesitate. Yes, yes, we are, he said, more to himself than anyone else. For a brief moment, their world shifted. It felt like the nightmare was finally coming to an end. They had made it to the rooftop, and now they had a chance to survive. The helicopter was only moments away, and the thought of being whisked away from the horror below was enough to make them breathe again. But then, the unexpected happened. Just as the helicopter drew closer, something went terribly wrong. The aircraft began to veer, almost as if it had lost control. George's heart skipped a beat as he watched in horror. "What's happening?" Lucy gasped. The helicopter swayed erratically, the wind from the blades whipping around them, making the rooftop tremble. Then, with a sickening lurch, it banked sharply, its descent too fast. The survivors watched in abject terror as the helicopter was overtaken by a swarm, zombies, falling from the sky as if the very air had become infected. The crew, fighting for their lives, was no match for the onslaught. The helicopter spiraled downward, spinning uncontrollably. In an instant, the hopeful sound of the blades stopped. The night was drowned in a horrific crash as the aircraft collided with a building below, exploding into a fiery blaze. "No!" George whispered, his eyes wide. "No, this can't be happening." His hands gripped the railing as if trying to hold the world steady. But nothing was steady anymore. The survivors had lost their only chance at rescue. The fire from the wreckage lit up the sky, but it wasn't a beacon of hope. It was a funeral pyre. Their last hope had burned to the ground, and they were left in a world with no way out. The survivors on the rooftop stood frozen, watching the helicopters fall with disbelief. The roaring flames from the wreckage below illuminated the sky like a macabre sunrise. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity as they processed the horror they had just witnessed. The explosion had sent shockwaves through the building, rattling the walls. George leaned against the rooftop's edge, his hands shaking. "It's over," he whispered. His words hung in the air, suffocating any shred of hope that remained. The helicopter, the one thing that had promised escape, was now nothing but a twisted heap of metal, fire, and death. There was no salvation, no escape. "We're stuck!" Lucy's voice cracked as she sank to her knees. Tears streamed down her face, the weight of their reality crashing down upon her. Adam, still shell-shocked, staggered back. He couldn't process what had happened. "That was supposed to be our way out," he murmured. The flames flickered in the distance, their orange glow casting eerie shadows on the survivors' faces. The wind carried the acrid scent of burning wreckage, mixing with the stench of death that already clung to the air. In the eerie silence that followed, all that was left was the harsh reality. They were stranded, and as the smoke from the helicopter's crash billowed into the sky, the weight of their hopelessness felt almost suffocating. The night had already shattered their spirits, but what came next would break them completely. It wasn't the undead outside that they had to fear. It was the threat that had quietly infiltrated their ranks. It started with a simple question. Adam turned to George, his eyes wide. "Why hasn't Sam said anything? He was with us when we were in the stairwell." George froze. His mind raced as he scanned the group. Sam, the quiet one who had been acting distant, hadn't said a word since they made it to the rooftop. And now, it seemed, something was wrong. "Sam?" George called out, his voice tight with suspicion. "You okay?" For a long moment, there was no answer. Sam simply stood there, his back turned to the group, staring into the flames. When he finally turned around, it was as if something in him had changed. His eyes were wild, vacant, and his skin had taken on a sickly pallor. Lucy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. No, not him." Sam's lip twitched into a twisted grin, and without warning, he lunged. It was too late. The others barely had time to react as Sam's teeth sank into George's arm. "No!" Adam shouted, pulling George back. "Get off him!" But Sam was already turning, eyes now clouded with the madness of infection. His transformation was rapid, and it didn't take long for the others to realize what had happened. Sam had been bitten, and now he was one of them. Lucy backed away, horror etched on her face. "We can't keep him. He'll bring them all here." The decision was horrifyingly clear. One of their own was now infected, and they had to decide whether to keep him alive or face the consequences of a full-scale outbreak within their ranks. They were faced with a brutal reality. Trust no one, not even each other. In the midst of the chaos, with zombies now pounding relentlessly at every door and every wall, George found himself alone in the control room, drenched in sweat. His hands trembled as he typed the emergency override codes, desperate for a miracle. The loud, almost deafening bangs from outside seemed to grow louder with every passing second. "I have to get this," he muttered, eyes scanning the screen, his breath ragged. "Come on, come on!" The system flickered, displaying the emergency lockdown procedures. Everything he needed to get the building's defenses back online. If he could just re-enable the security doors, get the elevators moving again, they might have a chance to regroup and escape. But as the final keystroke was pressed, the lights dimmed. The power, strained by the weight of the undead horde, sputtered once, twice, and then died. The room plunged into an eerie, suffocating darkness. George cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the control panel. It wasn't enough. The system had failed. Suddenly, the sound of shuffling feet grew louder. They were here. George spun around, his heart sinking as the door to the control room buckled, the undead scratching and groaning from the other side. It wasn't just the building that was crumbling. It was everything they had hoped for. Outside, the others, Lucy, Adam, and the rest, heard the rumbles of the assault as the control room door finally gave way with a violent crash. The scream that followed came from George, but it wasn't one of victory. It was the scream of a man whose last hope had been swallowed by the very thing he fought to control. In the distance, the survivors could hear the unmistakable sounds of doors being breached, the undead swarming through the hotel like a tidal wave. They were no longer safe. The last bastion of order, the last thread of hope, had been ripped away. In the darkness that followed the collapse of the control room, the survivors huddled together, the air thick with tension and fear. Their once hopeful eyes were now clouded with doubt. With no working systems, no plan, and nowhere left to run, they knew the only way out was to fight their way through. And that's when the cracks in their unity began to show. "Where's the food?" Lucy asked, her voice shaky but demanding. "We need to ration it." Adam's face tightened. He had been guarding their dwindling supplies for days, and now, as they gathered around him, his expression twisted with something darker. Something not entirely human. "Everything's fine," he snapped. "We've got enough for now." But the hesitation in his voice didn't go unnoticed. There was a moment, a pause, where the others exchanged uncertain glances. George, too, had noticed something was off about Adam. The man who had once been a rock, a pillar of strength, was now hiding something. "It's not fine," Lucy said, a sharp edge to her tone. "You've been keeping more for yourself?" Adam's eyes darted around the room, and in that instant, his facade cracked. "You think I'm stupid? You think I'm going to share everything when none of us are guaranteed to make it out of here?" The others recoiled. The desperation in Adam's voice was clear, but so was the truth. He had been hoarding supplies, rationing for himself, knowing the others wouldn't survive without them. "You're planning to leave us," George said, his voice cold as ice. The words felt like a betrayal. "When you get the chance, you'll run, and we'll be left to die." Adam sneered. "What's the point of playing nice when we're all dead anyway?" His voice was filled with venom, a complete shift from the man they thought they knew. "I'll do what I need to survive. And just like that, the group was no longer a team. They had been fractured by betrayal, and now they had to decide if they could trust each other, or if it was every man and woman for themselves. The hotel had become a tomb. With the undead closing in from every direction, the survivors had only one option left: escape. But escape came with a deadly choice. A murmur of voices filled the air as the group gathered in the shadow of the now failed control room. Everyone knew what had to be done, but no one wanted to say it aloud. "We can't make it out with all of us," George said, his voice hoarse. "We can't carry the wounded, the sick. We need to make a decision." The others stood in silence, each one wrestling with the decision. Should they leave behind the weakest, those who would drag them down? Or should they fight to save everyone, knowing it might cost them everything? "I'm not leaving him," Lucy whispered, her eyes fixed on Sam, the man who had been bitten earlier. He had been quieter, weaker, since the infection took hold, but he was still a part of the group, still human. "We don't have a choice," Adam shot back. His eyes were wild, his voice sharp. "He's already gone. He'll slow us down. If we don't leave him behind, we all die." It was a gut-wrenching decision that they could no longer avoid. The group had always been about survival, but now that meant something different. Some felt that saving the group as a whole was more important than any one person, but others held on to the belief that survival meant saving everyone. "I'm not letting him die," Lucy said fiercely, stepping towards Sam. She reached for his hand, but Sam's eyes were glazed over, filled with the creeping madness of infection. There was no easy answer, no perfect choice. In that moment, survival meant sacrifice. Would they protect the weakest and risk the lives of the rest? Or would they leave one behind to ensure the survival of the stronger? The tension in the room was palpable, as each survivor weighed the cost of their decision. The choice was clear: the survival of one, or the survival of all. Only time would tell which would win. The flames outside were no longer just a distant threat. They were a reality, growing with every passing second. The hotel, once a monument of luxury and wealth, had become an inferno, its towering windows reflecting the terror unfolding within. Smoke billowed in thick clouds, pouring through cracks and vents as the survivors huddled together in a maintenance tunnel, their breaths ragged, their hearts racing. Adam led the way, his hands shaking as he pulled open a rusted hatch. "This is it. Get through the tunnel, and we might make it out. Come on." Behind him, Lucy and George exchanged a glance, their eyes reflecting the same desperation. They could hear the echoes of the undead, those who had once been their guests and colleagues, shuffling closer, their growls growing louder as they neared the maintenance tunnel's entrance. "Move faster," George urged, his voice trembling as they crawled through the narrow space, the walls closing in on them, claustrophobic and suffocating. Adam's voice echoed through the dim corridor, strained with panic. "Keep moving, we're almost there." Behind them, the first of the undead breached the door to the maintenance tunnel. The shriek of the door splintering under their weight was the sound of doom. George's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward, sweat pouring down his face. Suddenly, a loud crash followed by a blast of heat threw them all forward. The building had finally given in to the fire. The walls trembled as the firestorm consumed the hotel's foundations, and the air around them became unbreathable. "We're not going to make it!" Lucy screamed, her voice cracking. But Adam pushed through, his fear overtaken by the drive to survive. They could hear the moans of the undead growing louder behind them, closer with every second. And then, just as the heat became unbearable, as their escape seemed impossible, the faint light of the outside world appeared ahead. The tunnel led them out into the open, a small alleyway in the back of the hotel. They stumbled into the night, gasping for air just as the hotel behind them erupted into flames. The deafening roar of the fire was accompanied by the terrifying collapse of the building, the skyscraper finally succumbing to the weight of its own destruction. But they had made it out. Barely. A new danger now loomed on the horizon, as the world outside was a wasteland of chaos. The fire was only a glimpse into what awaited them in the world beyond. The survivors stood at the edge of the hotel's ruins, watching as the once pristine building collapsed into a smoldering grave. The air was thick with smoke, the stench of burning steel and flesh wafting across the night sky. What had once been a symbol of wealth and privilege was now a tomb, an empty shell of shattered glass and crumbling stone. George couldn't bring himself to look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, trying to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The city, his city, was in ruins. The streets, once lined with the glittering lights of the prosperous, were now abandoned, dark and lifeless. What had begun as a luxury escape had become a nightmare that no one could have predicted. "Where do we go now?" Lucy asked, her voice small in the vastness of the night. There was no answer. Adam turned away, his face grim. The fire reflected in his eyes, but it wasn't the fire that terrified him. It was the uncertainty. The world, as they knew it, was gone, reduced to ashes. The survivors were no longer just running from the undead. They were running from a reality that no longer made sense. "Keep moving," George said, his voice tight. "We have to get out of here." But where could they go? The world outside had become a wasteland, the city reduced to rubble. The landscape ahead was barren, filled with shadows, and the occasional flicker of movement in the distance. The city had burned, and so had their hopes of returning to anything resembling normal. They walked, unsure of what lay ahead. The fire that had consumed the hotel was only the beginning. What awaited them now was far worse than anything they had faced inside those walls. From the hilltop, the survivors watched in silence as the city they once knew was consumed by flames. The distant glow of fire illuminated the sky, casting long shadows over the ruins below. The buildings, those that had stood for generations, were now little more than smoldering ruins. The streets, once bustling with life, were empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement from the undead that still roamed the ashes. George stood at the edge of the hill, his gaze fixed on the inferno below. The weight of everything, the loss, the destruction, the uncertainty pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Behind him, Lucy and Adam remained quiet, each lost in their thoughts. "We made it out," Adam finally spoke, though his words lacked the conviction they once had. "But what now? The world's gone." "It's not just the city," Lucy said softly. "It's everywhere. The fire. It's just the beginning. The undead will spread. This is bigger than we thought." They stood together, not as a family, not as a group, but as strangers thrown together by fate, with nothing left but the raw instinct to survive. The distant hum of the wind carried the eerie silence of the world they once knew, now a memory. The city had burned, but the fire was not the only thing that had consumed it. It was the people, the lives, and now they were scattered, lost in the night, just trying to find a place where they could breathe. "This is just the beginning," George whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The darkness ahead seemed endless, and there was no telling what lay in wait for them. For the first time, he realized that survival wasn't enough. The fight for life had become a fight for meaning, for hope, something that seemed harder to hold on to with every passing moment. As the survivors moved forward into the unknown, the crackling of a radio cut through the air. It was the same emergency channel they had been listening to, the one that had broadcasted warnings of the infection spreading across the city. "This is not a drill," the voice on the radio crackled, strained and desperate. "We are running out of time. The infection is everywhere. Stay alert, stay vigilant. You are not safe. The voice faltered, a brief silence filling the air before the broadcast continued. We have... The voice was interrupted by a loud crash, followed by static, and then nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. The survivors stopped in their tracks, listening as the radio flickered and sputtered, but nothing more came through. The voice, the last remaining lifeline to the outside world, had been cut off. "Do you think they're all dead?" Adam asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Lucy shook her head. "I don't know, but that was the last message. There's no one left to help us." The final broadcast had been a warning, one they hadn't been able to heed in time. The infection had spread too far, too fast. Now the survivors were on their own. The radio fell silent, its signal lost to the wind. The survivors stood motionless, the weight of that silence settling over them like a shroud. The faintest sounds of distant screams echoed in the distance, a reminder that the world outside was still in turmoil. The undead, though unseen, were still there, still hunting. As the night stretched on, the city below continued to burn, the orange glow reflecting off the clouds, casting a sickly hue over the landscape. But it wasn't the fire that consumed them. It was the silence that followed, the knowledge that no one was coming to save them, that their world had crumbled, and now they were nothing more than survivors, clinging to a fleeting hope that seemed to slip through their fingers with every passing moment. "Are we the last ones?" Lucy asked, her voice barely a whisper. George didn't answer. There was no answer to give. The silence was more deafening than any words could be. And then, as if in response, a distant scream echoed once more. It was the sound of someone or something fighting for their life, but it was far away. A sound that only deepened the hollow emptiness that had settled in the survivors' hearts. The radio, once their only link to the outside world, had died. The voice that once offered hope had faded into nothingness. And in that silence, the survivors realized their fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. If you've listened to this radio broadcast all the way to the end, thank you for joining us. Your support means everything to us. To help us continue bringing you immersive and engaging broadcasts like this on a daily basis, consider joining our channel by clicking on the Join button. Stay connected with us for daily video updates and be part of our growing community by subscribing to our channel. If you have any suggestions or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comment box below. And if you enjoyed this broadcast, please don't forget to like and share this video. Your support helps us reach more listeners and keeps us motivated to bring you the best content every day. Stay safe, stay informed, and until next time, thank you for being with us